Hello, welcome back to the Academic Podcast Entanglements. I'm your host, Milica Hinic. So today I have invited Brandon Edwards-Schuth, a postdoc researcher at the University of Oulu, Finland. He's joining us to discuss his concept of CPM, or critical podcast methodology. But first, tell us more about yourself.
Well, thank you for having me on. And I'm speaking from the occupied territories of the Sami Nation, that of the Sápmi, or what I think most people understand as Lapland, but it's Lapland in Finland, but Sápmi is the the correct way of putting that. My name's Brandon Edwards-Schuth. I had got my PhD in cultural studies and social thought in education from Washington State University, and I had done my master's and bachelor's in philosophy at San Diego State University. I guess I kind of early on before into my doctoral program, I guess you could say, oh, that's another white guy with the podcast. And I was like, oh, I don't know if I can swear. So darn, like I don't want to be that. But also like, oh, wait a minute. Like I come from this critical tradition. I'm also really interested in education as like a force for social and environmental justice. How could we combine that in a way that also combines like my background in activism? And so that's when I started to get critical edge about it to really try to differentiate critical podcasting from like the Joe Rogan type of podcasting, right? And
Yes.
so, yeah, basically that was my road to leading up to doing the critical podcasting methodologies as my doctoral, research.
Excellent. Yeah, you answered my why podcast question. I feel like that's the famous question everyone gives you.
Yeah.
Like,
Yes.
why? Why do you? So
Yeah. Yeah.
perfect. Thank you.
Mhm.
So critical podcasting methodology touches on several methods and theories taken from
Mhm.
various fields, like you mentioned. So we have
Mhm.
communications, cultural studies, philosophy, sociology, and so on. So I
Mhm.
feel as a researcher and communication scholar, I follow methods like a cook follows recipes. In
Mhm.
some cases, a simple dish may fulfill a simple recipe, a simple method to reach
Mhm.
your end goal. But in some cases, restrictions or sensitivities are attached. So this is where we require those careful and meaningful preparations, right? This is where
Mhm.
your critical podcasting methodology comes into play. Do you mind briefly explaining your critical podcasting methodology, recipe,
Yeah.
and your overall thought process in developing it?
Yeah. So I think I'll answer those in the reverse order because so the rationale for, I guess, building on the last kind of point I was talking about before, the rationale for creating one, and coming from a critical tradition, I wanted to try to create a critical podcasting methods that really emphasize the critical and one that like you couldn't sever from a critical approach because I really don't like it when capitalism, neoliberalism, white supremacy, all of these different very real and ongoing oppressions, the intersections of these like co-op things um, for their own personal like for their own like systemic profit and injustice and so forth. So to go back to the recipe part, I intentionally wanted to create a recipe that, if we want to keep going with that metaphor, that the chef would have to already have, like, I guess, certain knife skills or certain, like, maybe, I don't know, I can't think, I'm out of cooking metaphors here, but basically, I wanted to intentionally come at it from a critical lens. And so, in order to do this, the methods part, I also wanted to create in a very, like, not so specific way, one that could be utilized in different contexts. And that I think aligns with, I talked about it in the dissertation a bit, but like one that like it's always local, situational, and contextual, right? There's no like one solution or one universalism that applies to everybody or everything or every group or every instance. And so the recipe itself of critical podcasting methodology was one that I intentionally created to be like kind of broad and also open that other things could be utilized. And also like I kind of wrote about at the end. One that could be just like critical, insert whatever kind of medium you want methodology, right? Maybe it's a
Mhm.
critical documentary methodology. Maybe it's like you're creating a sweet, like critical, I don't know, album, like something, some music wise, like kind of thing. In the context of podcasting, and again, to differentiate from like a Joe Rogan or like even just a podcast that's not like, like meant or intended to be like educational, the important thing to differentiate it, that's part of the method, was this dialogical approach. And as somebody who, came out of the qualitative research, I mean, that's basically my focus. I don't do quant, maybe some mixed
Yeah.
methods, but, qual really focused here. Um, and specifically arts-based research methods, I saw it as like really important to focus on relationships and
Mhm.
community. Like some of the qual stuff that, when you go through a doctoral program, you take the qual and the research methods classes, and you do some like basically like it's always usually for like some sort of fixed outcome, or like you're studying the people and they're like coming up with results of that, and it's really like kind of objectifying. So it was
Mhm.
like, unless you're coming at it from a critical end, like there's this whole like this the researcher is separate from the researched or the observed or the, and I didn't like those dualisms. Again, the local,
Mhm.
situational, contextual were always part of that research. And I, back to the recipe, I guess the baker or the chef is also part of the food, but the food shouldn't be seen as something just to be consumed. It should be something that like you're doing together. Um, so maybe this is where the metaphor like starts to break off here. But the point is
Yeah,
that
yeah,
this
yeah.
recipe is like the research outcomes, and I don't even, I hate using that term. The whole point of it is like not necessarily the outcomes, but it's like the journey along the way. I guess that's where
Yes.
I'm trying to go with it. And
Yeah.
so um, yeah, so the recipe, given that it's very dialogically focused, that it specifically used like indigenous research methodologies, directly inspired from and utilizing research methodologies, the dialogic spiral in particular. I wanted to see if there's a way to like switch up research so that it's like you're not doing research on, you're doing research for and with. And so, like, if there was ever a quote unquote research outcome, it would be like, oh, like we created meaningful relationships, and now we're like, we become homies now. And like, I also know more about your life, and
Yeah.
you know about my life. And if we're in this together towards like, like really materially like taking on issues of social and environmental injustice, maybe we can share some of those instances, and I can like, mutual aid and solidarity towards those ends. And I think
Mhm.
what inspired me to kind of do that was I took in a bunch of like indigenous research methodology courses, and I saw that in the very decolonizing research way, like that's the aim of that research that is kind of missing in other parts. And so I don't know if I'm answering your question like in full and so directly, but uh,
No.
the recipe for critical podcasting methodologies is building meaningful relationships that through dialogue you really understand each other better, but
Mhm.
hopefully you'll also like do something and act together. And so because podcasts are, at least for the most part, like publicly accessible, it's not going to be something that strictly remains within the realm of academia, like, you know what I
Mhm.
mean, like, um, and I can talk more about that too, but that's the other component, is like people of the general public can like listen to this and be like, I don't know, people are doing this kind of research. These are like members of my community, or I can relate to that, and I'm
Yeah.
inspired. So
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, you did answer my question.
okay,
It's good.
I hope
Yeah.
so.
I tried making it like a comparative to like a recipe. I'm like, okay, maybe,
Yeah.
yeah, the environment, like the podcasting environment, it permits that
Mhm.
collaboration, that co-creation, and humility, I feel like, because we're the interviewer and the
Mhm.
participant, they each
Mhm.
are open to their vulnerabilities in that sense,
Yeah.
right? Depending
Yeah.
which stat like socioeconomic status they come from, or which disability they may have. There's a lot of
Yeah.
nuances there, right? So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to also recognize that, and I didn't have this in any of like the research setting that I conducted for CPM. Like this didn't happen, but I was prepared for it and recognized it because people talked about it. Was
Yeah.
this whole like, what if they don't? What if it doesn't happen? Like, what if they don't want to have a conversation? And I'm like,
Yes.
that's great.
Yeah.
That's great, because then that actually shows that like there's something going on. And I had referred to this study, I believe it was in New Zealand, where um, that really helped me answer that question of like, well, what happens if they don't want to have a conversation or no dialogue? I believe it was Maori children and white children. And when the classes were mixed together, the students in like being asked questions and participating in class, um, the Maori students felt like they weren't able to participate in a way that they felt like their voice was equal in the conversation in the classroom. And so when the researchers had separated the groups of students, Maori students and white students, the white students complained, "Oh, this is this is segregation. This isn't right. Like, how are we going to be equals and have equal voice?" And then when you had the Maori students, they asked the same prompt. They're like, "This is amazing because I'm actually able to voice when I was, over basically talked over when it was like together." And so there's like those nuances of like, oh, there's still some like colonial, legacy trauma going on, obviously, but also just like sometimes that doesn't happen, and then that what emerges is further learning of that specific context and situation.
You did touch upon the social studies teaching in elementary schools,
Mm-hmm.
and how they used the CPM in that context. So my
Yeah,
question is, have you seen an increase in academic podcasting use through knowledge mobilization course material or podcast lecture materials?
that's a good question. To be honest, I haven't, because I've just been kind of focused on postdoc research, and I'm still doing some podcast stuff here. I That's something that I do want to do, is to see, let's say within the past year or so, because as Ellie says, at this recording, it's been about a year since I finished my dissertation. I would be curious if there is an increase in that, because one, I think that would be great, and two, like I would be curious where the discussions are going in that direction, because I do think that there are spaces in which some shape or some form of podcasting, and ideally critical podcasting, can be incorporated. And I also suspect that there are spaces in which podcasting can be used in a way that probably wasn't what I was aiming for. I'm gonna have to get on that.
No worries. Thank you.
Mhm.
Yeah, so that was going on to my next question. Academic podcasters, basically, they're understanding. So, like you said, maybe they're using it in different ways that you don't even know. I
Mhm.
see many using it as like an educational tool and as methods or as both, but usually for the dissemination portion of their research. I feel that's what the big mobilizer is.
Mhm.
So then when I was
Yes.
thinking about it, I'm like, but I am using it as a method as well.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's dynamic.
Mhm. It's interesting because like even during the process of writing it, the process of using it in my research setting, and even now, I still struggle with like what is a research method? Specifically, like when you break it down and you get
Yeah,
like really, philosophical with it, because then,
yeah,
and maybe this is me still recovering from my like grad school like self-gaslighting of just like imposter syndrome, but I do think that it is like method and at the same time can be like a pedagogical tool.
mhm,
And so I think maybe that's one of the unique things about the medium, is that it's kind of both. Yeah, this might have to be like an ongoing further discussion, because I would be interested to talk about that further.
mhm.
But that was something I grappled with when I was applying it in my research context of teaching a social studies methods course, and I was like, is this a method? Like, yes, but
Mhm.
also no. But that means like yes, and so I don't know. It was really
Yeah,
challenging. Yeah.
yeah. That's where I'm at right now. In terms of higher education, how can critical podcasting methodology benefit the humanities and social sciences field?
I know that when you're an academic, it's some combination of like of research and teaching, and then service to the field, right? That's like those three main things that come with the I'm a professor and this is what I do. But I think that like, and it's not to like say like we have to do more work. It's like, yes, we do have to do more work, and I know we're also exploited and we don't get paid enough and all of that. And also, I think it's really important that that there ought to be some sort of public role in the research we do and the academic like practices that we do, because otherwise, and this is again why I'm really a big fan of like public pedagogy and hence the podcast stuff is just like I think we have some ethical obligation or role in society. And I'm not quite sure what that is entirely. And I don't even think it'd be right for me to prescribe it. But I think we need to be more involved instead of just sticking within like this formal educational setting, which is, in what I would understand it as like classrooms and yeah, basically that's it. And instead this informal learning of whether it be on the internet and social media or, wherever, or in your communities, ideally would be, a huge portion. I think that a lot of learning goes on there. I would argue probably the majority of learning goes on there. And it's overlooked because it's not like our domain. It's not formal education. It's not the colonial system of education.
In reading your work, you mentioned that critical educators, researchers must take on a scholar activist role and push against the boundaries, bridging that gap between academia and the wider public.
What is the role of the scholar activist, if that is even the role it ought to be or be named or whatever? Hopefully it would be in that direction, because I think given the crises of its various flavors in the world, I do think the academics need to do something. And specifically, I hope it would be community, organized and focused. I don't know. I know there are many of us who are not in tenured positions. They're exploitive. There's non-unionized positions. There's just, the vast, landscape of this is we're already under a lot of pressure, but I'm curious in which ways that we can push this to be part of the job, maybe at least recognized by the academic institutions. Because I hope that at some point, someday, that there can be other forms of publications that academics could do, and maybe that could be tied in with the public role of the scholar activist. I don't know. I'm not sure, but I guess in regards to the social, sciences and humanities, I would imagine it would happen easier there than some other areas. And at the same time, I could also imagine like a Carl Sagan, hard science having all the funding and money that, oh yeah, I could probably see that there too. But like, would it be a scholar activist role? I would hope so, but I don't know if it would be. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even if science was to use it, could they apply it within like health organizations for policy making changes? Like,
yeah.
just across organizations versus a different infrastructure and a different community base.
Yeah.
But again, I think they could still work. Maybe that's somebody else's project.
Yeah, that might be the future researchers out there who listen. This is your yeah.
Yeah, cool. there is a lot of things happening, and a lot of scholars are more interested in podcasting, which is fantastic. From 2 years ago, when I first started doing a podcast about a podcast, there was very little to no information, a lot of comparison to the radio. So I did look at the historical accounts of how radio created activism. So, what was my next question? Let's see here. I'm really focusing on like communities, building those relationships, those networks that you're talking about using critical podcasting methodology. And it really ties in well with my community engagement work. It is trying to bridge that gap between academic institutions, organizations, and the public. How do you even train someone to do a podcast about their research for an organization, say the city?
Yeah.
And would they be open and willing to do that?
Right. Oh, interesting. Huh. Yeah. Oh, well, that's so fascinating to me. Like I would love to see, like more like local communities, city, etc., to really explore that. And yeah, you're right. Like in terms of explaining it, let alone being like, okay, so then like after you hit the record button and then you've finished, you've like hit end record, there's some other things you have to do too. And like that's the part where like I lost people. So then
Yes.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
it's tough. It is tough. So in my research setting, I did like a social studies methods course, and it was basically multiple classes and also multiple semesters worth of like pre-service teachers who really, like in my eyes, they're teachers. They're at the end of their program. They already have many of them already have their placements. They're about to graduate, um, and similar to kind of what you were just talking about for your course, I had them. excuse me. I had them do a podcast for their final project, and it was to have a reflective um, discussion and then a dialogue amongst them about their teaching experiences, but also reflection on the lesson plans that they did for my course. Um, and to make it simple, because I had thought about that whole path, and I had some peers who had recommended, like, oh, like our librarian is like also does a podcast, and they have like a little uh, like a worksheet that teaches you like how to do it, and like it was good, but like I wanted it to be like even more like accessible or like easier for them to do. And so what I ended up doing for their final project is just like, okay, on like the final class days, you'll just come on in with your group. And I had multiple groups sit in to like do a intra group or an intergroup like dialogue, but just come in and we have, you know, we were fortunate enough to have like a mic in the room that also had a camera so folks on Zoom could participate, because this was also like COVID, the beginning of COVID time and so forth, um, which obviously still going. But point is that basically around a table, um, they were able to have that mic there, and I could just hit record on Zoom, and it would get everybody, but people, the Zoomers and the roomers, as I put it. And so that way, it's not like they had to like worry about the technology. Like I guess like I was kind of basically handling that, but they could focus instead on the discussions they were having with their peers and seeing like the different spirals emerge. I think providing them like that time and that space and being like, cool, it's only going to be like 10-15 minutes and
Yeah.
max, like, and they're
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
oh, okay, whoo, I don't have to like talk the whole time. And he's going to just hit the record button. Like, this is so easy. I don't even have to edit it. Like on their end, they're like, they don't have to edit it, you know, like, so it makes it a lot easier for them. And so like, I feel like they get like like, cool, I don't have to deal with that. I could do a podcast in addition to it. And I think this is also where, given my like local contextual situational like research setting was, is that part of the podcast was they would ask questions um, to future semester teachers. So like their peers, like next semester and the future semesters, they would ask a question of them. And typically it was about teaching. It was teaching related, but like typically it was about teaching or like their experiences or their worries or something along those lines, right? And earlier in the course, like before the podcast, like really early on the course, they would listen to prior semesters and the questions they had for them. And so they had already like kind of prepped in the beforehand, like they had this question bridge basically. And so I think that was also to like, I think that helped engage them in the sense that they really were doing a podcast. Because I mean, I think they really were, because even though like you go around and have each member of the group like ask their question, there were parts where like somebody would, before like they would say their question, like somebody would be like, oh yeah, I like worry about that, like I'm worried that like misinformation is going to get in my classroom, and like my student is going to say like my mom told me climate change isn't real, you know, something along those lines.
Yes.
And then they kind of go back and forth, and I was like, I didn't even plan this. Like they brought their own question to the table. And so like I think doing those things to like create like the starting point of it, to be as easy for them, you know, like
Yes.
they don't have to like carry much with them, I think that really helps. And so maybe those kind of ways I would recommend for people who are like thinking about like, how do I do podcasting as a method? How do I do podcasting as a pedagogy? I would say don't worry about the method and the pedagogy, and just like try to find a way to integrate it in a way that can be easiest for your students so they can focus on the dialogue and focus on like the relationships they're having, you know, at the table. Because I imagine like if you had an assignment and it was like you could do it like record it on your phones. Most
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
has either have it in their own pocket or they have somebody who has it near them. They can do that. That's good. And you guys, you could email it to like the professor's email, or like upload it to a Google Drive or something. You could do that too. I think that would be great. And maybe even like, even though like I wasn't talking, um, like I wasn't being like, oh, so what do you think? Or what do you think? Like I would,
Yeah.
introduce the podcast and let them talk the whole way through.
Mhm.
Um, there's still something that like when I was there and I was like listening, it was also like I was witnessing, and like I felt like I was part of the, I mean, obviously it was part of research, but I was with them in that group and in each group while they were talking. And I was just like, whoa, this is a wild experience that like isn't, this needs to be like done more. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've experienced that yet with your students doing podcasts, but like, uh, I would say for people who haven't yet, like
Yeah.
you should try that out because it's pretty wild. It's in a really awesome way.
Oh, it sounds like a really good strategy, actually. And it gets everyone comfortable. Like
Yeah.
you take away like the technology portion and they just focus on the
Yeah.
conversation, which majority of them are friends. They know each
Yeah.
other. And even if they don't, I guess it takes away that pressure that everyone is involved in this conversation. And okay, it is recorded. I think they get a little
Mm-hmm.
bit worrisome
Yeah.
in that sense.
When I first tell them about it, they're like, "Oh, it's like a presentation. Like I hate
Yeah.
presenting." And it's like, you're all teachers first and foremost, so like don't, you're good, but like, like you talk in front of a classroom like for a living. But I think getting rid of those things helps alleviate that anxiety. And I would have them beforehand work in their groups, and I had like a script, quote unquote. And I wouldn't say it was a script that they would sit there and read the entire thing, because that's not what it was. It was like a way for, if you are anxious and you didn't spend the time or didn't want to spend the time like just memorizing like, oh, my lesson plan was this and this, and then you get to the question part and you're just like, crap, like I don't remember the question. You
Yeah.
have it there,
I have the
but it's
question.
not like, yeah, but it's not like, if it's, let's say like if we were in the group, if I asked them a question that I thought about beforehand, it's not like you had the response on your script. You know what I mean? Like that
Mhm.
came from the improv student,
Mhm.
podcast nether. But yeah.
Yeah. No, that's great. That's really good. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah. I would be
Uh,
really interested to see other ways that people do it too, because I'm sure
hmm,
there's even better ways.
yeah, no, for sure. We'll see. I'm gonna find out what other people are doing. Hopefully,
Cool, cool.
hopefully through more interviews.
Yeah, yeah.
So now I'm gonna shift focus on the future. I did some investigating. I know you were on a project, social emotional learning, SEL.
Yeah, I played a little bit more of a supportive role because I'm interested in SEL, some social emotional learning, because of like I think that there's a lot of skills that if you want to be a participating and aware, like, an engaged citizen in a democracy, I think there are some good components of SEL that you could take away with. And so that was kind of like my role, but I played more of a supportive role in
Mhm.
the podcast creation and the methodology. But yeah, that was one thing that I have been engaged with since then.
Anything else that you're into currently, podcast wise,
So yeah, so
or not?
currently yeah, no, yeah, currently I'm creating the podcast for the CitiRats project that I'm a postdoc on here in Oulu, and it'll be a little bit more of a traditional, I would say, like kind of like Radiolab, kind of like uh, was it like This American Life, like that kind of style narrative podcast. But I'm curious to see, in the process of interviewing all these researchers and looking at their data and engaging with, this postdoc project. I'm curious to see, was there anything that like I missed along the way in terms of like doing a podcast,
Mhm.
and also like how can it still be critical podcast methods if you're maybe presenting it in a way that's more narrative or story driven rather than, I don't know, the main focus of, CPM. So I'm curious to see
Oh,
how that'll pan out. But yeah, I'm still doing the podcasts, but
that's good. It's
yeah.
interesting that you mentioned that. So the genre. the
Mhm.
genre of storytelling or
Yeah.
narrative. So that
Mhm.
impacts the critical podcasting methodology.
Yeah, I think in some ways it can. So like there are
Mm,
things that, for example, in the narrative podcasting genre, I think could be really critical. I think obviously it's how you frame it and also like what you don't frame. I guess I guess what I was trying to get at was CPM, at least how I understand it, seems to be very dialogue and relationship building. And so if you enter into a project in which you are kind of doing like not, I wouldn't say like a report on, but like something along that style. And you're presenting in a narrative and you're talking about the stakes that are at play for this research. I think there can be ways that you can still do it that's critical. Um, and I don't know. I guess it's like again, like the local situational contextual of when you do a podcast or you employ these methods, and the methods will be different too.
mhm.
So I guess it'll just be like another development in a different direction, but still CPM related. So I don't know. I'll let you know when I get there. We'll see.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
So I'm going to wrap things up. We're good for time. What are your hopes for academic podcast communities?
I would hope that in doing more of this work, academia at large will be more supportive and inclusive of these projects that we do. I hope that the academic podcasters will really make an effort to go and work, with and for communities while they do their podcasting, because I think that's ultimately the aim, and purpose of it. I hope they're not paywalling their episodes on Patreon or something, because that would defeat the whole point of the public pedagogy. Yeah, and I hope we build like a really awesome community that collabs with each other and just really gets a diversity of voices and perspectives, so that um, we all just get to learn more about our world and the worlds that we live in, and build all those meaningful relationships along the way, so that obviously when the revolution happens, obviously, we all have the friends along the way to help us. But yeah.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
Yeah.
And then I have a signature question.
Oh,
What is your favorite podcast?
so I think my go-to podcast all the time, they're just so consistent, and it's really good. And I understand if people can't tolerate this, because I get it, but it's the podcast Knowledge Fight, and it's basically a left critique of Alex Jones's bullshit. And so basically, they would do all the work and listen to his shows, both in the past and the present, and really show how he is a grifter. He's lying, he's manipulating people. And it's also, for me, I guess I've always had like an interest on like keeping an eye on the alt right and the right wing to see like,
Mhm.
I mean, you're in Canada, so you're good. I might have to run there, but the point is,
Oh
the
dear.
United States is pretty terrible.
Oh,
And so it's always fascinating to hear what the discourses are that are ongoing within that echo chamber. And so I don't have the time or the patience to listen, nor desire to listen to any of that. And so instead, I can get it filtered through, left perspective. So Knowledge Fight was really good. I think though, if there was one that like people should be listening to, it's Seriously Wrong. The Seriously Wrong podcast. They are education, they're humor, and they have great politics. I am a strong advocate for library socialism and the sweetheart practice. You know,
mhm.
so if you don't know about those, look those up.
Yeah,
It's
I'm gonna look them up.
amazing. Yeah, I referenced them in my dissertation. I got to reach out to them and talk to them. I don't even know if they would want to talk to me, but they are
Of
Seriously
course
Wrong
they
is
would.
amazing. Well, maybe they can come on your podcast and talk to you as well, because
Oh dear.
I think there's a lot of educational stuff that's coming out of it. So
Yeah, I'll take
yeah,
a look for sure.
yeah,
Maybe we can
yeah.
all hop on together.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess one other thing, and I don't know when this will be out, but it might be out by the time you're publish this and talk about it. But doing a podcast with some other Finnish peers here, it's called Mosscast, and so it'll be education and environment, more multi-species justice oriented. So where the intersection of those for artists and academics are, and so yeah, definitely have to look out for that, and I hope that we can
Yeah.
potentially have you on, because we have a signature question of what music have you been jamming to lately? Because we have a
Oh,
Spotify list for our guests, and so you might have to ask that
great.
for all your guests.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I'd be so interested in that actually. I've been doing a lot of environmental climate change research in certain classes.
Oh, nice.
So me and one of the other students were working on a documentary for a final project.
That's
We'll
amazing.
see what happens. I am like, yeah, super pumped.
Whoa,
Yeah,
that's amazing.
yeah, I did do a little, like a short podcast, the Attunement Project, looking at
Hmm.
the aesthetics and looked at noise pollution. I created a soundscape of the Hamilton
Oh,
Harbor.
cool. Wow.
Yeah, so that was my previous semester. That was one of my courses, and I tied in podcasting.
That is
So
so
yeah,
cool. Okay,
yeah,
I got to look up the Attunement Project and find that one because that's amazing. Yeah, we would love to have you on talk about
yeah.
that some more. You just have to have your song for the Spotify playlist ready, of course.
Okay, sounds good. No pressure.
Yeah,
Thank you for taking the time out of your day to discuss podcasting with me.
absolutely. Love to. Thank you for
Thank
inviting me on.
you. I appreciate Brandon's explanation of his CPM method. It really demonstrates the importance of building relationships and focusing on community, the local, situational, and contextual. He also incorporates Indigenous colonizing methods, inclusive to decolonizing research, which are all very important. They really speak to the ethical responsibility we as academic podcasters have to the public. For details on these and other works from Brandon Edwards-Schuth, please see the show notes below. Stay tuned for our next episode with Ian M. Cook and his take on podcasts as a methodology. Ciao for now.